Okay. I'm calling the February 8th, 2021 Committee of the Whole meeting to order. First item on the agenda is the adoption of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
All right, we have a motion from Reverend Mack. Do I have a second?
Second.
And a second from Ms. Waters. Any discussion about the agenda, approval of the agenda? All right, please vote.
Time is up.
Somebody's got to.
Aye. They kicked me out.
Julie should vote aye. Ms. Copley.
Okay, that motion passes. The next item is 2A, online public comments. And Ms. Waters, can you update us on that for today's meeting?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Darby. All of the public comments were regarding the issue that was taken up in the special call meeting. So we have had that meeting and we'll.
Use your microphone.
Oh, yes, all of the public comments that were submitted were in reference to the special call meeting. So we did have those discussions in the meeting prior to this one and are moving forward. We will be having discussion about the continuing format of public comments. And so please just stay tuned to the meeting for that.
Thank you. And we all received those electronically. I think you mentioned that. Next item is item 3, the superintendent's report. We're going to start with the COVID-19 update.
Thank you. Maggie, if you go ahead and add the slides, please. I want to thank Maggie Dangerfield for managing the slides for us today. I'll be very brief. The first slide simply shows the board, the recent disease activity by county. What we want to point out is that this slide reflects the first time we've shown this report since the state changed the way they calculate the percent positive. So it used to be the number of positive tests per 100,000 population, and now it is a simpler calculation. It's the number of people who were tested in a particular time period divided into the number of positive tests to give you the percentage of those who tested positive. So we couldn't compare these. It would be inappropriate to compare these data with previous data. Needless to say, the rate in our community is still very high, and everyone should continue to take all the precautions they possibly can. The following slide shows the positive cases in Charleston County schools. So you'll see that we had that peak that we expected right after the holidays, and we come down, but every single time we're out of school, even for a weekend, we come back with a higher number that decreases over time. There could be lots of explanations for that, but we're still working to get the COVID positive cases down further. We would hope that everyone would take extra precaution, especially with the long weekend coming up. The next slide, we talk about vaccinations, and it's our last slide. Mr. Borelli will address that one.
Thank you, Dr. Postlewaite. So despite the fact that we don't have a designated time for receiving the vaccine to this point, the staff is still making great progress with fine-tuning our plan. That plan will vary significantly based on how fast the vaccine will roll out, as well as how many vaccines we will get in a given period of time. So there are a lot of unknowns that will decide on how quickly we can get this done. But we have established those 4 sites that are listed there. We replaced Stall with North Charleston because we have a better throughput at North Charleston High School related to the number of rooms available in a pattern where we can get people in and out of there. Regarding the rural sites, we're working with DHEC on supporting them with our schools for their vaccination plan. So to cover the rural areas, DHEC is looking at establishing those sites, and we will just support them with our schools on the weekends or during spring break if it ends up coming at that point. I will say that as far as the planning goes, we've really worked hard to establish groupings within our schools to be able to break that down into numbers of teachers and staff that can be supported at any given time. So if they tell us it's 100 per day, if they tell us 500 per day, if they tell us it's 600 per day, we're hoping that we've got groupings within our schools to fit that block of available personnel. And as I've mentioned earlier, we're still planning on using our nurses to distribute that vaccination. They're authorized to do so. They're actually loading teacher data into the DHEC database so that when the time comes, it'll be less paperwork to process that through the DHEC vaccination site. So that covers it from my end.
Thanks, Mr. Barone. That concludes our COVID-19 report.
All right, our next item is some special recognition. Who's doing special recognition? Reverend Mack?
Reverend Mack and Erica Taylor, I think, have worked together.
I'm very
Yes.
excited that we're doing this special recognition, but I'll let you.
Absolutely. So, is Mr. Darby on?
Yeah.
Mr. Darby,
There he is.
Yes, sir.
there he is. Mr. Darby, it is indeed a privilege and an honor to be able to recognize you on today for your great work that you have done and the mission that you have set out to do. There's a poem that I want to, not a poem, but a story that was written by a young man by the name of Joshua Dickerson. And Mr. Darby, your quest and the mission that you've been doing for the North Charleston student, here's what this young man said. He said, "I woke myself up because we ain't got an alarm clock. Dug in the dirty clothes basket because ain't nobody washed my uniform. Brushed my hair and teeth in the dark because the lights ain't on. Even got my babysitter ready because my mama wasn't home. Got up, got us both school on time to eat us a good breakfast. When I got to class, the teacher fussed because I ain't got a pencil." Mr. Darby, you set out a quest to help your students, your community in which you grew up in which you served for a period or course of a time. You have been acknowledged nationally, locally, but honestly, I want to say to you that you did not ask for any of this recognition. You did not seek for it, but you were on a mission, you were on a journey because you knew there was a reason and a cause to do the work that needed to get done, and you set out to do that. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, on behalf of our superintendent and the staff and all of Charleston County School District, I'd like to present to you on this day, it's in my presence, but we're going to make sure that it's clearly delivered to you by tomorrow morning. And this is this challenge coin that says, "Students are the heart of our work." This challenge coin, Mr. Darby, I hope that you will continue to display in your presence as a reminder of the great work that you have done within North Charleston and the precedents that you have set within Charleston County, within the state of South Carolina, and nationally, of just what we are to do as individuals, as citizens, and helping those that are in need. I can say on the clerical side that indeed you will be blessed for your work that you set out to do. The greatest blessing is those when you do things and you don't seek a reward in return. But the Bible says that we are to store our treasures up in heaven, because down here, if we do them, they will corrupt. You will be blessed, Mr. Darby, for the work that you set out to do. And at this time, we would like to give you a standing ovation.
Oh, my.
On
Oh, my. Oh, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Again, sir, thank you for your great work, and I know that there'll be other things yet to come.
Yes, sir.
In this quest for the North Charleston student body, but also throughout Charleston County as well. Again, we say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Do you care to say anything at this time?
Well, Reverend Mack, with all veracity, sir, I would like to say, as I constantly say, that this is not a play with one actor by the name of Darby, but a drama with many, many actors, and each actor playing his part or her part exceedingly well. But when it boils down to the final analysis, and they give me credit, but the credit really is due to Dr. Postlewaite. And I say that with all veracity, and the reason is, along with the school board, that you have given me the opportunity and a chance to work for North Charleston High School. So really, I am indebted to Dr. Postlewaite and the school board. I'm also appreciative of the resources and the assistance that Ms. Belcher has given, along with Dr. Williams with the support, and definitely Mr. Strodman. So I just want to conclude by saying thank each of you, but in the final analysis, the credit really belongs to Dr. Postlewaite for giving me a chance. And I really mean that. I'm not saying it just to be saying it, because I admire her for what she is doing and what she has done for our children. And I'm just very appreciative that I have been allowed to work for Charleston County School District by the means of North Charleston High School. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Darby, you set an example for all of us as human beings, and I hope that we can do a fifth of what you're doing.
Say, don't even try, Kate, because we are not going to live up to
No,
that.
we're not going to, but I'm going to do my best. So thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is item 4, the Strategic Education Committee. Ms. Frederick?
Thank you, Ms. Darby. So we have 2 items on the agenda today. The first item is the draft academic calendar for 2021-2022. And this is just an action item to move the draft calendar forward for public input. Ms. Belcher?
I'm actually going to turn over to Ms. Woody, who designed the calendar, so she can talk through the differences.
Thank you. Good evening, board. A group of teacher representatives and some of the learning services leadership team helped draft these 2 calendar options. We used the guidelines that were on the first page of the document that you received, some of which is state statute, some of which is local board guidelines, and then also some requests that we received. For instance, the biggest request probably comes in partnering with Berkeley and Dorchester too to try to coordinate calendars. I've been in touch with both of their chief academic officers and have found that they are recommending the spring break for their districts will be the week of April 11th through the 15th, which matches with the first calendar. Really the only difference between the 2 calendars is the spring break week. When you don't start school until the 3rd week of August, which is state statute, and you try to end as the first week in June, there are not a lot of options for us when we take into consideration all of the guidelines. And so really the variance between the 2 calendars is the spring break week. And so tonight we're just recommending that these 2 calendar options go forward for the public to then have input.
Do we have any questions, Ms. Coates?
No, thank you.
Ms. Waters?
No, thank you.
Ms. Darby? Yep. Dr. Frazier? Dr. French?
I was a little surprised that President's Day was left off as a holiday. That just wondered if you could speak to that.
Yes, ma'am. President's Day is not considered a protected holiday as far as the calendar and the state statutes. So as a compromise, we made President's Day an e-learning day. Should we have that day off, it will move the calendar to the final date for teachers being the second week in June, which the guideline was to try to finish in the first week of June. And so that was the compromise without having to kick it to a second week in June.
Is it okay if I ask another question, or you want to keep going?
You can go.
The other thing is I know that we are really concerned about making sure that our students catch up next year. And I'm not sure if the guideline for ending this first week of June is hard and fast. Is that something that we could consider? Because I think it also helps everyone to have those breaks. And February, March tends to be a long time with no break. And I just didn't know if that was a possibility. And some of the half days and early release days, I know people have expressed some concerns about them being in the middle of the week, but the main issue for me was like, the priority should be for academics, I assume. And then, but are there some things that we have a little bit of flexibility on that might work for the district to make sure our kids get enough learning time?
Shirley, I think we can say two things about that, and then Ms. Belcher may want to say more, but in the past, when we've brought a calendar to the board that extended into June, the board has sent the calendar back, asking us to rework it because parents didn't like that. And so we tend not to bring a calendar that runs too far into June for that reason. However, the other thing I'll say is in the summer of 22, as Ms. Belcher mentioned earlier today, we would expect to be running some really intensive summer academy work for a lot of children so that we let school out early, give kids a bit of a break, and then get back into what we hope would be a pretty intensive 24 to 36 months year-round calendar for some students.
Thank you. That helps me to understand better.
Ms. Green?
You're welcome.
Ms. Coakley?
Who did we have working on these, like coordinating these changes again? Who's helped coordinate these changes? Teachers?
So the original group was a subset of teachers and then district level people within the Learning Services Division. We then took the calendar drafts to the principal's cabinet for input, and then we took it to the teachers of the year from every school were invited to attend to give input. So we've had some significant teacher representatives, and we've had the principal's cabinet review the drafts so far.
Thank you.
Reverend Mack?
No, thank you. No question.
I have moved that we move the calendar options forward for public input through a survey on the CCSD website and determine the date for the survey results to be reported to the board.
Second.
So what date do we want to determine? Emily, what date do we want that to be?
Yeah, typically we bring it back to the board for a final decision at the February board meeting. So
Okay.
we probably need it that week prior so we can take a look at the comments and see if there's any input. It usually goes out for about 10 days.
Can it go out for 10 days and be back on the? Yeah, it could. I mean, it can go out as long as, I mean, they can tabulate, that's all tabulated. So if you could, if you get it out tomorrow and then as long as it can be reported to the board at the February 22nd meeting, is that okay? It's 14 days. Yeah. They can tabulate, they can do it, but it's only 10. They can do it. They do it. They've done it the last couple of years that way.
Can I ask one clarifying question of the board?
Yeah.
Would there be preference for us noting when Berkeley County and Dorchester's potential spring breaks are as part of what goes out to the public?
Sure, I think that'd be a good idea. If that's the biggest question or input you're getting from teachers, I would think that would make sense.
It's just not on the draft that we gave you, so I was just curious if you thought that was important or not.
That'd be great. Thank you, Ms. Woody.
Thank you.
I made a motion. Did somebody second?
That's it.
Eric seconded. Okay.
Great, thank you. The next is an informational item only. It's a map data review. Ms. Belcher?
Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. Appreciate it. As you requested, we're coming to present two data test summaries that, taken together, assessed our kindergarten students through our 9th grade. One of them is the MAP test, and the second test is the Fast Bridge test. We're going to go through these results in detail to give you a sense of the overall conclusions. Just going to wait for the deck. If that's okay. So first of all, I'm going to start with the MAP growth assessment. So that's the name of the test, the MAP growth assessment. And forgive me for talking through some of these basic information, but I want to make sure that folks at home, as well as you, understand how to compare information, what the test actually assesses. So this test is a computer adaptive assessment, which means that as a child answers a question, if they get it right, they get a harder question. If they get it wrong, they get an easier question. So it self-regulates to get to where the student is. And it measures both students' achievement, so their actual knowledge of grade level information, as well as growth over time. Just to make sure I'm clarifying, so achievement is how well a student has learned skills in a subject compared to similar students nationwide. And the way that MAP defines similar students are those students who have approximately the same Ritz score, which I'll talk about in a minute, the same number of weeks of instruction, and the same grade and subject area. So we're comparing how, at this point in time, our students are here where other students in the country. Growth is a measure of students' progress from generally the fall to the winter. So in this deck, for the most part, winter 2020 refers to last year, the fall of 19 to the winter of 2020. And winter 2021 refers to the fall of 2020 to this time right now. The Ritz score is something that's unusual about the MAP, and that actually is an indication of how the student performed in the subject area. It's a technical thing, but what's useful to know is as the number goes up, that means it's a higher grade level. And if you're a 3rd grade student and you're actually performing at the 4th grade level, you'll have a higher Ritz score, which would typically be in the 4th grade space. And that matters is because as we start to compare information here, we're often talking about comparing growth goals. So how did students do in terms of what they were expected to do for students who are similar to them? But we also want to make sure that we step back and say, well, what does that mean compared to grade level standards? Because if a student starts way farther behind the starting line, we want to make sure that we're also holding ourselves accountable to making sure they're prepared for the grade level. The final piece on this is the percentile, which is a measure of a grade and subject area the student's score is equal to or exceeding. So if a student scores at the 60th percentile, that means there are 59 percentile of students behind them, and there are 40% of the student body across the nation who performed higher than they did. So that's the general framework. I think it's important to note a couple of things. We were required by the state to give the MAP test a little earlier than we typically do. So we gave the MAP test in December. We typically give it in January. So while we're comparing other students who took the test in December, when we compare last year to this year, there was more instructional time last year. The second thing I want to make sure that I call out about the MAP test is and it just spaced out on my, make sure I get it right. I'm going to turn it over to Buffy and it'll come back to me. I'm an older lady. It's been a long day.
And it's hot.
Yes.
It is.
No, it's not.
It is not. Sorry.
So the graphs that you see on the screen represent the overall median percentiles for math and reading for elementary grades 2 through 5 for fall and winter of last year and this year. We use the median percentiles in order to get a clearer picture of the current achievement levels of students without risking the skewing of data by averaging wide ranges of high or low scores that might be heightened in a less than normal circumstance like we have or experiencing now. It's important to remember that achievement at the 50th percentile is, as Ms. Belcher said, it is considered to be at the national average. If you look at achievement in reading and math last year as compared to this year for grades 2 through 5, you'll see that CCSD remains in the average to above average range in achievement overall, meaning that even in a pandemic, overall grades 2 through 5 are able to maintain their rate of learning in what would be considered typical for students in a normal year, even though our current year has been anything but normal or typical. For math, the median percentile for this fall was at the 53rd percentile. This is 3 percentage points. This is 3 percentage points below where students came into school in math last fall. But even with less time between those test administrations, like Ms. Belcher alluded to, and even during the pandemic, students in grades 2 through 5 overall did not decrease in math, but they actually still managed to maintain the 53rd percentile in winter. Now, what does that mean? It means that students actually grew at the national average growth rate in order to maintain the same level from fall to winter testing windows. So for reading, grades 2 through 5, they remain constant with students coming in the fall this year at the 60th percentile. There was a slight decline in 3 percentage points in reading from fall to winter this year with the median, but this most likely is due, from what we can tell, from the prominent difference in performance of online learners as opposed to in-person learners, which we'll talk about a little bit later. To summarize, if we think of this as a race or a marathon, and compared with runners around the country in a normal year, CCSD as a whole is still managing to not only keep up, but actually outpace or outrun the average runners, even with all the challenges that have come. In other words, students as a whole in elementary are growing despite the pandemic conditions, and the students attending in person are actually performing better than normal conditions when the pandemic did not exist. Okay, next slide. These graphs represent the median percentiles overall on math and reading for our middle grades or our middle school grades 6 through 8 for last year and this year. In math, the median percentile this fall is at the 56th percentile. This is actually 4 percentage points above the 52nd percentile, or where students came into school last fall. Although performance in grades 6 through 8 math dipped slightly to the 54th percentile, or 2 points below fall performance, performance is still above where students were in the winter of last year and still indicates learning did occur above the rate of the national average. Reading median percentile is at the 63rd percentile this fall, which is slightly higher than it was for students coming into the fall of last year. Although a decline of 4 percentage points from fall to winter occurred this year in reading, it's again important to note that this winter's 59th percentile for reading is still above the national average of the 50th percentile. So in summary, in thinking about all of the information we've covered for 2 through 5 and 6 through 8, overall for both elementary and middle in reading and math, the median percentiles for CCSD are all above the 50th percentile. Again, all considered to be above the national average in achievement, indicating that half of our test takers are scoring above what is considered average nationally. All this data indicates that the impact of COVID and lost learning opportunities is currently not as significant in CCSD as it probably could have been. And most likely, this is due in large part to the percentage of students who are actually engaging in in-person instruction. Otherwise, we would have seen a much more significant impact. We're also digging into this data in the more intricate level to develop tiered, skill-specific, content-specific supports for students. And next slide, Ms. Belcher.
So I want to make sure I pause to give credit to Ms. Roberts because a lot of data mining is trying to figure out what is actually going on to help us figure out what the implications are for what we're going to do differently in instruction. So as I said, this test is not, if you compare it to last year, we had less instructional time this year. The other point I wanted to make is we're being compared against a norm reference group that was pre-COVID. So it's the same norm reference group that we compared last year, just to put that out there. So we are not comparing, we're comparing student performance beyond the pandemic to student performance beyond the pandemic. This slide is intending to show a lot of things so that if you want to dig down, you can get a sense of where we're reaching our conclusions, but also in part to show that in a district this size, even when we tell an overarching story, there's a lot of nuance and differentiated experiences out there. And we don't want to generalize because we're going to have to make some strategic decisions about where we intervene. So the first column shows math across the district from 2nd to 8th grade. So we have individual grade levels broken out. And then again, the summary information on the bottom. This slide is highlighting growth. So the extent to which students met the expected growth. And you can see by the quick color coding, green is better. And as it moves towards red, that's where we're more concerned. There's a number underneath the percentage that is the Ritz score. And that's just included to give you a sense that we should be seeing the Ritz score go up in each grade level and over time, so that the level of achievement as well as growth is going up. And in some places, you'll see that's not exactly true. So I'm calling that out just to make sure you know we need to, even though students are meeting their growth goals, the message there is on average, our students were starting behind and we have more work to catch up. So generally, one thing to call out is that similar numbers of students are meeting growth goals in both math and reading, but the variance, so within a category on reading growth goals is much wider than on math growth goals. So we have some students who are doing very well and some students are struggling. In math, it's more contained and compacted, I think in part because of our curriculum. Across all subject and grade bands, the average percentile student achievement is generally constant. So again, we're comparing last year to this year, reading to math. So if we go to the next slide. Now we're starting to dig in a little bit more at the elementary level just to make sure we're calling out the story, because it does differ in grades 2 to 5 than between our middle school students. So this year, 53% of our students met their growth goals in math as compared to this point last year when 49% of students met their growth in math. So across the system in 2nd to 5th grade, we are seeing real progress in mathematics. This year, 45% of students met growth goals in reading and compared to this point last year, where 50% of students met them. Now, what this says to me is that we really have work to do in reading, which is again, not a surprise to this board because that's an area where we're going to take on an additional priority in the future, beginning next year. The last thing to call out is that we see the greatest gap among our current 2nd grade students in reading. And that matters because 3rd grade is generally the grade level by which if students don't know how to read, all of content starts to switch to reading to learn rather than knowing how to read. So clearly there's a place there where we need to do an intervention at 2nd grade reading. On the next slide, this is the same snapshot, this time of middle school. So again, you're comparing winter to winter in math and winter to winter in reading. I think the color code tells the story. We made more progress in mathematics than in reading. So 53% of students met their growth goals in math as compared to 52% last year. And then we're seeing progress, but it's more modest at the middle school level. And this year, 47% of our students met growth goals in reading as compared to this point last year when 55% of students met growth goals. Now, again, there was more instructional time last year, and obviously there are some distractions this year as compared to last year, but still that's a place where we have to put more focus. Going to the next slide. This gives us a highlight of overall grade level performance And to the extent to which there's gaps in grade level, again, the reason for including this is to make sure that we can sort of show that not all grade levels are created equal, and that we're going to have to adjust our instruction to make sure that we're really digging in on where there are gaps. I think the good news is from the 2nd to 8th grade, the percent of students meeting math goals increases with each grade level. And again, the variance in growth in math scores is 12% in the 2nd to 5, where it's 3% in reading.
Okay, so this visual that you see on the screen depicts the percentage of students learning in person versus online who are meeting their fall to winter growth targets in reading and math in elementary. Based on the data, the students learning in person are progressing at a higher rate and meeting growth targets at a higher percentage in both reading and math than our students learning online. And I think you can see that that's pretty obvious by the on the screen. In reading, we see a 13 percentage point difference in growth targets being met by students learning in person as opposed to those learning online. And in math, we see 18 percentage point difference in growth targets being met. It's evident in this data that engaging in in-person learning really does make a difference for our students' growth and achievement. Okay, next slide. This visual depicts the percentage of students learning in person versus online, who again are also meeting those fall to winter growth targets in reading and math, but this time in our middle schools. Just as we saw in the elementary data, middle school students learning in person are progressing at a higher rate and meeting growth targets at a higher percentage in both reading and math than our students who are learning online. In reading, we see an 11 percentage point difference in growth targets being met by students who are learning in person as opposed to those learning online. And in math, we see a 6 percentage point difference. So again, based on this data, engaging in in-person instruction is yielding higher growth outcomes for all of our students, elementary and middle. And Ms. Belcher.
We wanted to make sure that we did report on acceleration schools, knowing that this is a mission critical item and of particular interest to this board. This data reflects the middle and elementary schools. It does not include the high schools. And just to make sure I'm orienting you to the graph, the first column in the math is the current growth targets for acceleration schools. The second column is comparing it to non-acceleration schools. And the same is true for reading. I think the headline is the percentage of students meeting growth goals at the acceleration schools is in general lower than other district schools. And they're meeting reading goals at a lower rate than math goals, but then at a lower rate also than last year at this time. Meminger, we want to make sure we call it out, given this has been a board priority, is consistently outperforming other acceleration schools across all grade levels and subject areas, not just kindergarten. So I think it's important to recognize that. So in some places where we have a strong leader, we're seeing exceptional progress. And I also would say that a lot of our schools in the acceleration status have a disproportionate number of students learning at home, which could contribute to this. And again, it's less instructional time than last year. On average, across all acceleration schools, second grade reading has the least amount of students reaching growth goals, and fifth grade math has the highest. So then we want to talk through the FastBridge assessment, which is a different assessment that we administer to our early childhood students. Now, this is largely used for screening and progress monitoring. And what it does is it's a composite score. In reading, it's a composite score of 4 of 12 tests, and in math, it's a composite score of 14 subtests. What that means is each time the test is administered, the test is testing a subset of all these different concepts. In reading, it can include things like letter names, letter sounds, word rhyming, and in math, it includes things like matching quantities. So this is one object. When I add my Coke, it's 2 objects. So getting that idea. The test is administered individually because these students are often young. So the teacher or another staff member marks the responses. And then it usually takes no more between 10 and 15 minutes. In the way it's constructed, FastBridge actually organizes students in order to show us where there's levels of risk. So which students are on track to meeting or exceeding grade level targets, which students there's some risk who might be at risk of falling behind, which is we would label yellow in our graph, and then which students are at high risk of falling behind their peers.
So the graph on the screen represents 3 levels of reading performance in our primary grades of kindergarten and first grade. Again, as Ms. Belcher just described, based on the Fastbridge Early Reading Assessment. Green represents the percentage of students who are on track to meet and exceed grade level expectations, while yellow represents those students exhibiting possible signs of falling behind their peers. And red represents those students showing more definitive signs of falling behind. We didn't break this data down by in-person and online for you here, but we are seeing similar patterns as what we have seen in our 2 through 8 data, with in-person students performing higher than our students who are learning online. We typically do see a slight decline in students performing on track for grade level from fall to winter. For kindergarten and first grade this fall, we did see a lower percentage of students starting the year on track for reading. We see a similar trend from fall to winter this year for our kindergartners, where a higher percentage of students are showing signs of some or a higher possibility of falling behind. In first grade, a slightly higher percentage of students are performing on track, with a lower percentage of these first graders showing possible signs of falling behind. We did also have fewer students enrolled in pre-K and also kindergarten this year. And again, there was less instructional time between the fall and winter administrations, which could also possibly contribute to some of the outcomes that you saw. Okay, next one. The graph you see on the screen represents the risk levels for math in our primary grades, K1, based on the Fastbridge Early Math Assessment. As a reminder, green represents percentage of students on track to meet or exceed grade level expectations. Yellow represents those exhibiting possible signs of falling behind, and red represents those with more definitive signs. Again, we didn't break this data down by in-person versus online, but the trend is the same, as a similar pattern. As seen in reading for kindergarten and first grade this fall, a lower percentage of students started this year on track for math as opposed to last year. We see a similar trend for winter. With 62% of our kindergartners on track in winter, a higher percentage, 38% of students, are showing some or a higher possibility of falling behind their peers in winter than in fall. With 64%, a higher percentage of first graders are on track for math in winter than in fall, showing progress in math for our first graders. So in summary, to think about what we saw with our Fastbridge data, overall, the data for K1 reading and math tell us that more students are performing on track for math compared to reading, and that currently a higher percentage of students are showing possible signs of falling behind their peers this year than they were last year this time. This is really an expected outcome based on the projections of the impact of COVID-related learning loss. We knew that and expected that to a certain extent. This data further illustrates the need to enhance our accelerated learning opportunities for our K1 students and the strategic use of our instructional data that we receive from our interim assessments like Fastbridge and also MAP to identify those specific knowledge and skills to target so that we can more effectively impact student learning outcomes.
So just to make sure we're stepping back to, these are the conclusions that we're reaching on this data. First and foremost, our early childhood students are behind. We need to focus on catching those students up. And it's important to remember that a good group of parents also kept some of their children home or still enrolled in daycare. So there's a subset of students that we have not yet tested because they haven't been in school. So we need to make sure that we're really focusing on our early childhood in the coming year. I think we can say definitively that across the system, we're making progress in mathematics. If you remember, mathematics was the place that we saw the greatest dip when we came back in the fall. But we're seeing promising signals that Bridges, illustrative math, Zern, and that really significant professional learning around effective math instruction are making a real difference in student learning. Which begs the question that we need to focus on reading. We're seeing real gaps across the district in reading, and we need to make sure that we're making a similar level of investment in professional learning, quality curriculum materials to ensure that we're catching our students up in reading readiness and then reading to learn. And we continue to need to focus on our acceleration schools and those students who are currently learning online so that once they come back in person, we can move fast to catch them up to the rest of their peers. And I think it's important to call out because it was a significant and a very difficult decision for this board and the previous board, as well as a lot of hard work from many people in this room, including our exceptional operations team, nursing services, the principals at the school, and the teachers who work there every day. But while the variance does exist within the system, we really don't have a significant COVID gap across the system. We have a targeted COVID gap. That means that it was worth it for us to invest in opening schools because it's allowed us to maintain more progress than similar districts at this time. I'd love to open it up for questions for me or Ms. Roberts about the data and our conclusions to make sure we've made the right ones.
Thank you, Ms. Belcher. Thank you, Ms. Roberts. Cindy, we'll start with you.
No, thank you.
Ms. Waters?
Just a question around the students in the acceleration zones having being overwhelmingly online learners. Is that, you should go ahead.
Well, more than half are probably in person, but there's a disproportionate number as compared to other schools.
And yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
So is the pod situation something that we could target in that area? I'm assuming that the reason is that there are just more of their parents who don't feel comfortable. Is there a support system we're thinking about for getting more of the students who need to be in school the most in school?
That is where we're targeting it. So we began with North Charleston, are moving downtown, and then we'll move out to districts, District 23, District 9, to have those conversations with families about what would be helpful to them and what would give them more confidence about sending their child to school. In some cases, that leads to the parent making the decision to send their child to school. Other cases, that means we provide school supplies, try to make arrangements for attendance in a pod. And we're also seeing at least 3 schools have done a community-wide, including Mr. Darby in North Charleston, knocking on doors and trying to have conversations with teachers and parents and advocates who know the families to try to convince them to come to school or understand their concerns. Because as I think I keep reading about in regard to the vaccine, some people are clear yes, some people are not yet. And I think that might be true in some cases with our families. If they had more confidence in what we're doing and could see the results, they could decide something different. We're also seeing some schools experiment with pods inside the school. So if there's a high level of distrust of the system, a small subset of kids can learn at school in a pod-like environment. I think we're trying to do whatever we can to bridge that gap. But I think a lot of it will also have to be us investing next year to catch up those students who have fallen behind through no fault of their own because of COVID.
Thank you. Do we keep, go ahead. Okay. My second question was, with regard to the MAP data, when the MAP data comes back, it does break down individual competencies, right? Like so what component of reading students are struggling with? Are you using that to inform the curriculum that's going to be chosen as we look to get a new ELA curriculum?
Not so much on the curriculum, but definitely on the individualized instructional plan or class instructional plans or school level instructional plans for students. Most curriculum that are tier 1 or well regarded either by the state of Louisiana or education reports or have a demonstrated track record of results with a diverse population like ours, they will address all those areas that are addressed within the MAP priorities.
Okay, thank you.
If I could add one thing, we're also utilizing that data as we're working on developing plans for catching up students, as you were saying.
Thank you.
Ms. Darby?
I don't have any questions. It sounds good. I'm glad, it's good to see this data. I'm glad we're spending this time on this today. And I look forward to hearing more about what we're going to do for the reading curriculum.
Dr. Frazier?
I have several questions. My first question is, some of the time can we have this data in an earlier portion of the day so that we can be alert and focus on what we're doing? This time of day, it was just really, really hard to keep up with what was going on. But I did notice that you said that second grade reading was something that we needed to focus on. Want to know, what are we going to do about that? Because we know that if a child is behind by third grade, he's less likely to catch up. So what are going to be your strategies for mitigating this issue district-wide? And then my second question is, now that we're looking at Meeting Street schools and interfacing with some of our protocols for catching students up? Are we going to be comparing test scores to see what schools are doing better and whether we're making right decisions about where we're going in the future?
So on your first question, this is part of what we've been talking about with the board priorities of what are the strategies for catching students up, whether it's tutoring, summer acceleration, more time on task, and trying to make sure that we also bring in the principals and teachers who know their student body the best to help create customized solutions for their schools, because it might be a combination of any of those things. I think the good news is on second grade and third grade reading, we have a demonstrated track record with Read to Succeed. The state has invested, and we've had that summer camp in place for the last few years. And that as an intervention strategy has shored up some gaps. So we can use that as a foundation for thinking about what do we need to do to catch up our second graders who are going to be third graders next year so that they're not at risk of not being on track for reading. On your second question, and I'm sorry, ma'am, I couldn't hold it in my head. Could you repeat it? That's me, I'm old.
Present later, earlier in the day.
No.
My second question was, we're looking at.
Yes, I'm sorry, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Yes, we will, and we can do more comparison data. At this point, we wanted to give you a sense of the CCSD district schools, but anyone who's doing it better than we are, or just giving a sense of how we're doing in our system and our community at serving kids, we want to bring that data so we can have a sense of who's doing it right and replicate it. Forgive me.
Thank you.
My memory is going at the end of the day, too.
Hey, so I had a question about, so I've heard from constituents that some of the online students end up have had their teachers change multiple times during the year. But what I wanted to ask about the acceleration schools where we're seeing more of the learning loss for online students, are those students affected in that same way? And could that explain some of the learning loss?
Probably not. And it's not that, I think some of the challenge with acceleration schools is that those students started behind before we went into COVID, and the COVID situation has just exacerbated it. And the reason I say it's not necessarily that most of the changes of multiple teachers are as more waves of students have come back. So we see more teachers move from virtual instruction to in-person instruction, and to accommodate those families who still want virtual instruction, we've had to reconsolidate classes at the end of the quarter and at the end of the semester. Generally, in the acceleration schools, there's been less of that wave coming back. So there's been, on the good side, less disruption in terms of teachers. But I do think one of the challenges is ensuring that we're engaging all students. And those are also students who need additional supports. And are they getting them in all the ways?
Okay, and then the next question is, so we're seeing this at the second grade level, this really not meeting growth goals. So what do we know about how our teachers for first and second grade and K are being trained to help kids who really are coming in with no proficiency at all? Like, this is the really vulnerable group that they're coming into school and they don't know their numerology. They can't read at all. So do we know if our teaching pool has been trained well enough in that area to help those kids catch up?
I think the good news is that the field has made some progress in this area. So even if it's a well-trained, experienced teacher, I think there are innovations that are helping. So our commitment to early childhood, for example, in the Mary Ford Center and CD classes, those do tend to give kids a leg up on kindergarten, because we particularly design those to serve the kids who have struggled or come in, I'll use the line behind the starting line. We've also invested in open court phonics in the last couple of years, which goes back to reading foundations. We did not have a system-wide phonics program. And while a lot of students can learn how to read just by listening to what their families say going out into stores, to ensure it's thorough, a systematic approach to phonics is really helpful. And that's something that's relatively new. And because we know that now, we've done a lot of professional development actually on the phonics piece. I think the challenge that we face is actually in the reading comprehension, reading fluency, and then building on the upper grades, ensuring that kids are getting exposed to grade level text and really grappling with that text. So, my standard line is we all can read the New York Times. For some of us, it's easier than others because we're used to the vocabulary. We're used to reading at that level of rigor. But with additional support, we all can understand what's in there. And that's what we need to make sure that we're doing is shoring up skills and vocabulary, even as they're also reading at grade levels and not getting held behind in science or social studies.
Ms. Green?
Just want to say, glad to hear the good news about, because I was not expecting that we would have done as well as we have. Still got a lot of work to do, but it's, the data could have been a lot worse. So happy about that. Thank you guys for all you do.
Ms. Coakley?
Thank you. I just want to say really quick, maybe you're talking about phonics. Phonics, I learned to read phonetically. So you hear say something is new. I'm not sure where South Carolina dropped the ball on some kids, but I learned to read using phonics. Additional supports, like you said, all children can be helped with those additional supports. Not just additional supports, but the people that are given those supports are genuine about the support that's being given. When I keep listening to our conversations as a parent, and I keep hearing COVID, I keep hearing lots of people are affected due to COVID. But as an African-American mother, I want y'all to know that we've been over affected before COVID. So when we keep talking about the people that are behind that starting line, we're behind that starting line. So it's not just 6 months for some people. So coming here and the strategy, like she said, the strategies, how do we strategize? How do we move forward to make these children get to where they're at? To know that children are failing in accelerated schools, I'm not surprised because as a parent, and when I listened to what was going on, that's what I said. You can't take children who you already say are failing and put them someplace and expect them to achieve. In real life, we can tell people how to and what to stop doing, but without genuine and well put and well meant supports on any level, whether it's funding, friendship, information, it won't mean anything. So we want to make sure that when we strategize going forward, I keep hearing input from teachers and the people that are there, but I want to make sure that parents' voices and our student voices are being heard too. And my thing is always focus on the small issues, and we won't have the bigger issues. So where we're starting out, providing chances to our minority students, we should start providing and implementing more opportunities before second grade, earlier in life. The earlier prevention, the better.
Right, I agree with you, ma'am. As you know, I think that's one of our key priorities is to broaden early childhood and make it more academically rigorous so that there is no such thing as any student starting behind the starting line in Charleston County anymore. It's just going to take time and I think attention from this board.
Reverend Mack?
All right. Let me just first say thank you for the report, and I'm glad that we are beginning to take a deeper dive into the data. I guess my only question that I would ask without asking for extra work to be done, but is there a way of potentially expanding the data a little bit more if it's the desire and the pleasure of the board? So you did 2 years. Is it possible to do 3 years? To really look at the trend of what actually is happening over a course of the time. What happens when we start out with the rating and with kids in second grade? Well, by that rating from second, third, fourth, fifth, by the time they get to six, what is that trend like? I mean, are we actually making gains across the board, or the new measures that we put in place over the course of the years, is that really working? Or what is working, what's not working? Or where did we take a dip, or did we make changes there in that dip that may have occurred? I think as we begin to extract this data and really look at what we're really doing, because over the course of time, we have made different changes along the way. So where did those changes occur? What was the data before we made those changes, and how did it improve or did it not improve? And just moving forward, if it's the pleasure of the board, that we do take an expandable look at those data even longer, just to see how are we trending, and what improvements we need to do or don't, or where those areas are that we need to focus more on. Because I think with the goals that we're setting, we need to make sure that we are accomplishing, closing the gap in reading, closing the gap in mathematics, and as we move forward. So I guess that's a open-ended question, but is it possible?
Anything is possible. I think the one thing I would say is, like, Mrs. Von Coates and I had this conversation in our small group. This is a snapshot in time, and it's one test that each group of students took. So one group of students took the Fast Bridge, another group of students took the MAP. It only assesses some of the story. And so I think one of the risks always of looking at data is that this is the whole story. And when we talk about goals for the board and looking at our achievement, I think we want to take a preponderance of the evidence approach. So what we haven't seen, because we didn't take the test last year, is the SC Ready assessment, which is specifically designed to assess, did we teach what we were supposed to teach in South Carolina at that grade level? And how do we know? And that's missing. This is a national normed test, but there's always some variances by state, right? We told you that we were not necessarily comparing apples to apples because last year they had more instructional time. That variance is going to exist. I think the value for us is what's the whole story, and are we seeing that trend seems to be there? So I think we can look back definitely, but I want to make sure I'm calling out that these assessments change, and it's hard to make a hypothesis because there's lots of different things going in. And one of my challenges, and Ms. Roberts is really leading this work with Ms. Simmons and Dr. Williams, is like the so what? Like, we know the data, but what are we going to do differently about the data? And the story I'm telling you is a high level story, but the data that really matters is the classroom teachers' data and how that informs how they're going to teach differently the next day. And we don't have that routine in place consistently enough across the system so that we can do real-time remedies of, like, this child did not understand this concept. I'm going to reteach it, and I'm going to teach it in this way to ensure he or she gets it. So I don't mind looking at the longitudinal data, but I think my point to you is this story might change the next time I bring a data point to you, because we've got a different part of the whole, and I don't want us to get too tied to just this.
Okay, having said all of that, then I would say that we would, I would, for me, and if it's a pleasure of the board, that we begin to define then what data we're going to extract and what measure we're going to use that tells the whole story, and shape that, and then let that be the working tool that comes before us, so that we can definitively say, this is working, this is not working, and here's what the trend looks like. Then we need to, at some point, begin to build that template of what that looks like, and then let the board take a look at it and say, okay, this view here gives us a clear view of what we want to see as far as data reporting as we move forward, to make sure that we are accomplishing the goals that we're setting.
Absolutely, sir. Yep, appreciate that. Thank you.
Reverend Mack, I just.
Lauren,
Dr. Frazier.
She's chairing this part of the meeting.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to make sure, and I work at the middle school level. I've administered the MAP as a counselor, but had no training. And I just want to emphasize that we implement a training program for persons administering the MAP or any other test, that it encompass a district-wide kind of training program, so that when teachers receive the data, that they know what to do with it and how to use it for student growth.
I appreciate that. I think we're trying to do that work under Ms. Roberts' leadership.
We offer much training for administration, but we're also working through our lead meetings with instructional coaches and also with our leaders, and offering sessions with teachers through online modules, but also with some of our representatives from NWA, which is the vendor for MAP.
Ms. Coakley also has an additional question.
And this is it, and thank you. So while we're sitting here and we're looking at this right here, I just want to figure out how can we make sure parents, I think parents need to understand how to read this to just help. The same questions that we're sitting here trying to figure out, like strategize, how can we do and how can we implement things? So education on parents. behalf. Minority achievement accomplishments. When I'm looking at this as a whole, sometimes when we look at different things for school, we're able to ask, how many African-American people, aren't achieving this right here. But as I'm looking at this right here, I don't see it. So how could I be able to get that? And when I look at that and I see the green and the yellow and the red, to me, it's like distorts the numbers of the people that we're trying to help. But if I can't see if they're not being helped in here, if they're not achieving in this test score, how do I know how many minorities or, how do we see that within this scope right here? Like separate that. I know, like I said, on the smaller scale, we know how many minorities and what's happening, and we're able to pinpoint and say, hey, they're failing compared to these white people. But overall, how can we look at that and say if they are, if they're not, and if they're not, how can we implement ways and educate our parents to understand it?
And the first part of your question, both MAP and FastBridge and school level folks do have family reports that explain the data, and that's part of the data days that we have set up so that teachers can talk through what that means to the extent that the parents want to understand it. And the second part of your question, we are looking at the racial breakout of individual groups within our district to hold ourselves accountable to the point of cultural competency and equity. We just chose to not share that data this evening, in part because I think sometimes when we share that kind of information, it's been perceived as being critical of the students. And I think it's actually a reflection on us of where we're falling short and where we have more places to go. So we chose to do this data in this way to highlight the overall story, but no, we are paying attention to any equity gaps as well.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next we are going to item number 5, other board committees. The first item A is Audit and Finance Committee review.
Mr. Kennedy, do you have access to a mic back there, or do you need to come to the podium?
I'll come up.
We've got several action items that has come into you from the Audit and Finance Committee, which met last week. Details would have been in your board docs, but I'm going to ask Mr. Kennedy if he could briefly describe each of the action items. And I guess we have to vote on each one. Is that right? So we would just start with, and then if anybody has any questions.
We do
action items for today?
Yeah, they're not action items, but they would come forward to the board for action.
I'm sorry. Yeah, because we are,
Yep.
I'm sorry. Okay.
But you're telling us that action items 1 through 5 will be action items at the board agenda, and information items 1 through 4 will be information items.
Right, exactly. I'm sorry. I was
That's
thinking,
okay.
I was thinking we were at the board meeting.
Nope,
So
that's,
So-
it's been a long day.
does
So I
anybody
do-
have any questions for Mr. Kennedy on any of these items?
No.
I didn't think you would. so. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy.
We'll get you next week. I mean, in 2 weeks.
Well done. Well done.
Okay.
Okay,
So that's it.
any other, okay, Ms. Green, thank you. Next are a couple of policy items. Dr. French, I'll let you start with item 5B, which is policy JFB.
Okay, so policy JFB is an update to eliminate obsolete language that is from the expired No Child Left Behind legislation. And we did rearrange a paragraph just to make things a little bit more clear. You may, if you looked at this, you may have some questions about the, the persistently dangerous school language. If you do, I can give you a little bit more information about that, or Dr. Coakley can. But basically, that has not been changed. And if people are ready to consider that, we'd entertain a motion for
To
approval.
approve this forward for voting at the board meeting?
Second?
Does anyone have any questions? All right, then let's go ahead and vote. Oh, I'm sorry. The motion passes. Thank you. So, and do I read the motion out again or not?
No, you don't need to if it's up there. I mean,
All right, that's fine. The next policy is policy BDE, and there are a couple of different updates on this. Mainly, it's to change the language on the policy section for the liaisons. It would remove the operations liaison, and it would change the policy and personnel liaison to the policy liaison. The second part of the changes is an update to the language about discussion and debate and the CAL meetings. So it's just changed a little bit about the time limits.
Dr. French, are you okay if I?
Oh, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just, because Dr. French we worked together on these policy changes, and just to give a little history for those of you who, just got on the board, this is a policy that we wrote about 4 years ago based on Greenville's policy, and we haven't really made any changes to it since we started. And once we got going with it, we found we needed to make some changes. That's why we're taking out operations and the personnel part, because operations kind of things are handled typically in audit and finance. And then the whole part about the timing was written by a board member, and we never completely implemented it. We've done the 2-minute timer for us, but it wasn't clear about the steps we took to continue to have debate. We never enforced that part of it. I do think Dr. French and I talked about, continuing to have 2 minutes, which I think all of us pay attention to that. We might go over it a teeny bit, but we're not going on 4 minutes. And so that's why we cleaned that up, to really have that part of the policy to be something we're following. So
may I ask a question, or do we have a motion on?
I move to approve first reading of policy BDE.
I second. So in the part about the timing, because you're right, the words, if they don't mean anything, we never do them. Is this saying that we get to speak for 2 minutes to ask questions, and then we stop and they they can answer the questions?
Yes.
So rather than ask a question, wait for an answer, ask a
No,
question.
you could ask a question.
But I think that if we did that under a 2-minute rule, where we haven't changed anything, but we could say, okay, I want these next 3 questions asked, and then they could answer them.
It really depends. I mean, Toshiba does a good job of maybe somebody else as an example. Courtney asks the question, and it takes her 30 seconds to ask the question, and Toshiba stops the timer and lets the person answer.
That's
So,
I wanted to see that you
yes.
had a visualization of how to execute the work.
Yes, because she's timing me right now because I'm talking. So I'm in my 2 minutes. So that would be how that is. But it wasn't clear before about that. So we wanted to clarify that.
And so the other question is why, I heard that personnel and operations are obsolete, but I do see that we don't have a formal or really anywhere defined to talk about the district's execution of their jobs, I guess. And we've seen some questions coming across recently about things about why is this done, or has this been looked at, or who's monitoring this? If you remove the parts about that, where is that formalized process and forum for us to discuss these in committee meetings and board meetings?
So Dr. French and I had a really good conversation about that about 3 weeks ago. And then I was checked out for 2 weeks while my son got married. But what we talked about doing is having the committee of the whole liaisons and the committee of the whole chair, us do like a once a month Zoom, and where we could kind of plan out an agenda for an ideal agenda for the year of when would we like to hear about some of those kinds of things. So we're not hearing about the capital plan every month, but we might do a workshop where we hear the capital plan, or we might, some of the kind of operational things that we don't need to have an agenda item for every month, but those are some things that we typically like to hear about.
So I guess and I, like I said, I voted to approve first reading. But again, that's 4 people getting together and deciding what's allowed to be on the agenda. And referencing some questions that have been asked in email and stuff, and the answer comes back as that's not the right time or place. I think if we were to create a more formal place where we can talk about what's your operations, who's executing this, how did that get executed, where are we now? Or as I've talked with another board member, when a large gap in performance pops up, we don't have a place where that board member could have come to the board and said, this is where I want to talk about this item. And I don't know that you can solve that tonight, but this is the last vestige of where we have something where the board has a formal way of saying, I want to know what you're doing.
Yeah,
Rather
let
than
us-
the
let us-
staff saying, I want to tell you what we're talking about.
Well, let us meet once and come back to you with some ideas.
Right, because we'll approve this. This is
Yeah.
probably a longer conversation.
Agreed.
I have a
Does anyone-
question there.
Yep, Dr. Frazier has a question.
Yeah. And why did we eliminate personnel out of that?
Because most of the personnel issues are things that we handle either through executive session, like we did today, or either through executive session, they're through the budget where we're deciding what we want teacher pay to be, which I hope will raise, that kind of stuff. So we're handling those in other places. They really are addressed in other areas for the most part.
Anyone else have a question? Hearing no more discussion, let's go ahead and vote. And the motion passes. That item 5D is a temporary public comment policy. And I just want to say thank you to Ms. Waters for working on this. She worked with staff to make something happen for the public here. And do you want to talk about what we're going to do since you brought it, or you want me to explain it?
Sure. Well, you can go ahead and I can fill in if.
All right, so basically what we're going to try to do now is have a system where people can come to the meeting and be in a sort of a green room or a waiting area in order to come in and speak their public comments in person. And I believe staff was working on a way to help that happen. Then the other part is we continue the option to submit your comments online, and that those would be read out. But we'll have a 30-minute time limit on that section of the meeting, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
The other thing I wanted to ask was whether, as we consider this temporary policy, whether we would like to also suspend the need for second reading so that we might be able to implement it at the February 22nd meeting if staff feels prepared for that.
Can I add one thing before they?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just wanted to indicate that the 30-minute time limit is not just a benefit for time's sake, but also for us and for those in this room, but for the guests who come forward. Because if we sort of have it go on and on, it could be an impediment to folks actually being able to stay and wait and give their comments. And so we just really want it to be efficient for all parties involved.
Okay.
So is this 30 minutes of in-person and 30 minutes of electronic per
No.
hour, or
It's 30 minutes total, and the time will be divided up
based on?
based on the number of people.
So, would it be okay if I asked staff if they felt like that we could implement this in 2 weeks, or do you need more
Checking
time?
the policy. I think there's a policy we have to suspend.
Mhm.
I was
Yeah, there
gonna
is.
say,
Right, there is a
did y'all
policy.
consider the current policy where it just allows everybody 2 minutes?
It does, that's still part of it. You have up to 2 minutes to
Right.
speak, but we are also limiting the total amount of time to 30 minutes. Does that answer your
Because the
question?
former one was 2
Right,
minutes,
right,
but
right.
it could be an hour if there were 30 people out there.
We already have a policy that's 2 minutes per and 30. I think what she just did was wrote it so that it'll be in person or electronic.
Okay.
Yeah, our current policy is not 30. It's in person 2 minutes, but we've had one that's been 30, but it
Oh,
isn't
but
right
it's in
now.
person too, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So I'll make a motion, but wait, Dr. Postlewaite didn't get to answer your question, Dr.
Right,
French.
because that might affect the
We
motion.
interrupted.
No, I believe we can do it. I just want to be clear with everyone that if 15 people have signed up to speak in person, that's about all we can handle right now with COVID, and safely space them and take care of them, because we'll have to have the line out the door. We don't have a room large enough for people to sit, so we'll have to have someone monitor and let people in the doors. So once we reach 15, for the time being, that probably will be all that we can manage.
Okay.
And since this is a temporary policy, should we include that? So people just don't, a bunch of people just don't come, they know that we will have to limit it to 15?
Well, sure, but I mean, I think for most of the time, we're not going to have like 50 people show up anyway. Yeah, until, I guess it just depends, but.
So that was the reason for my response. Depending on the topic, we could have a whole room full that wants to show up.
And so we can make sure it, in the public comments section, that it always says
15
in-person comments will be the limit, and because of spacing issues. And
So I think one of the problems will come in, and I'm just kind of thinking my operational brain came on. That's 15 people that get to come in here and talk. What do we do with the other 200 that show up at the front door? So maybe we need to say something that, I'm not sure what the solution is, but their worries is how do they put 200 people in various green rooms operating with social distancing who showed up wanting to be one of the 15?
I think that what we're saying is that we'll have to turn them away.
Turn them away?
First
Yeah.
15.
They can't be in here.
All right, hold on, one at a time.
So let me answer your question, Cindy, Ms. Coates. I think that the intent of the policy was to allow people, if they want to stand outside on the sidewalk, I don't suppose we can stop them, but we're not going to provide an accommodation for people to come and watch the meeting out in the vestibule.
Right.
That's not going to be possible. At least I don't think so from what I have been told. So we are trying to provide an accommodation where 15 people might be able to come in and speak in person. And, it will be first come, first serve, so people can do that, but they can't all stay inside and they can't all speak necessarily.
Right, exactly. Mr. Browie and team have done a little bit of work on this. So to answer your question, yes, if the board wishes to suspend your policy and pass it on one reading next time, yes, we will be ready to implement it in March. As long as you work with that, you're happy with our modifying as we try something and see what works and what doesn't. It may be that we go to an online sign up to speak in person, and the deadline is thus and such, so someone doesn't make the drive here just to be turned away. So, I mean, there are lots of logistics to think about, and we can think about those more quickly than we would have. I believe we can do this if we can have a little bit of leeway to try 2 or 3 different approaches.
This would be, so basically we would entertain a motion tonight to move it to the board meeting for a first reading. At that time, will we determine whether to suspend policy for second reading?
So I'll make a motion.
I was gonna say, can we put in the motion the policy we're gonna suspend? I've got it pulled out.
I make a motion to approve first reading of the temporary public comment policy and suspend policy BGD.
Yes.
So that we only have to have
So
one
that's
reading.
approved at the next meeting. We've done the only reading that needs. to
Right,
happen.
so it would be in effect for March, though, not in February. We've got to have the first reading at the February board meeting.
Kristen, Dr. French, can I make one comment?
Did we get a second for the motion first?
Second.
Okay, yes. Ms. Hardrick? Ms. Hardrick?
This is a great idea. Perhaps there's some type of online registration, the first 15 that register or get confirmation emails that they're allowed to come on site.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
That's a good idea. All right. And do we have any further discussion?
Just want to thank the staff for being so responsive with this. They didn't give any pushback or, have any issues. They really came quickly with some suggestions, and I'm happy we're going to be able to open this back up.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for this work.
Ms. Ham and Ms. Taylor's.
Any other comments or questions? I think we're voting then.
Yep.
The motion passes. I am slightly concerned with the language in that motion.
You want to pull it back up? I didn't even look at it. What's the language that concerns you?
It just says that we're going to suspend policy BDGBE,
That
but
is
no,
the
with
poli-
no end.
Oh, well, that just means we're
That's for that
suspending it
motion.
for the second reading. So it just means we'll have one reading.
Okay, just wanted
We'll
to
approve it
clarify.
through first reading.
I see what
Yeah.
you're saying. This is not a motion to indefinitely suspend that
Right, no,
policy.
we're
This
just
is a
suspending
motion
it for
to
that.
approve this and suspend the policy for this motion.
Thank you for helping me understand that.
All right. Okay, other business, item 6A, legislative report, Reverend Mack.
Yes, board members, I'm happy to have with us today to present to the entire board, Mr. Darrell Campbell, who's going to give us a legislative update and moving forward, at least through the session, we're going to have Mr. Campbell to come to give us an update. So, Mr. Campbell?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity. I know I'm standing in between you and dinner this evening, so I'll try to be brief as possible. First, about myself, I'm the principal of the Campbell Consulting Group. I've been providing government relations and public affairs for the last 21 years and had an opportunity during that time to meet Mrs. Joyce Green and become friends. So I've been around for a little while. In terms of advocacy, if you look at other entities that employ lobbyists like Trident Tech or the Medical University of South Carolina, USC, it's not about just supporting an agenda or promoting an agenda or opposing legislation. It's also being a resource. And you're seeing that now with the Medical University of South Carolina being involved in the public health pandemic and also just in public health issues in general. And the same thing is for K through 12. CCSD is a premier school district, and members not only in your legislative delegation, but across the state want to know how are you operating, your best practices, your governance, and et cetera. So you will be, from time to time, your administration will be asked to testify on legislation or hearings, not necessarily being opposed or supporting, but just also providing knowledge and expertise. And I think that's always critical. So let me just give you a general overview about where we are in the General Assembly at this point. We're going into the 5th week. It's the first year of a 2-year session. And of course, you remember last year, the pandemic interrupted the session. So we started January 12th. We look to finish our adjourn by May, the second Thursday in May. I think it's around May 11th or May 12th. So this year, the General Assembly is certainly operating a lot cautiously and carefully, so to make sure they can minimize any interruptions this year, because there's lots on the agenda as well. So we don't operate the way we normally operate. There's not many people in the lobby if you have visited in the legislature in years past. We don't have access to members' building unless we are there for a meeting. So it's a lot differently than what we've operated. We've been lobbying by text, virtual, or they even don't encourage us to be there if we don't need to be there, but to watch live stream of all the hearings. And so, but it's just a different year altogether. Anyway, in terms of legislation, of course, you know, when they passed Act 135 last year due to the economic uncertainty in the pandemic, in Act 135, they suspended the step increases for teachers. So this year, the House has passed a supplemental appropriation, H 3609, and it's going to be taken up in the Senate tomorrow, as a matter of fact, at 3 o'clock. And so I do expect that bill to be expedited and probably into the governor's desk in another matter of a week or so. So I certainly do appreciate the board officers for reaching out to you members of the legislative delegation to ask them or encourage them to support this legislation. In terms of K-12 policy issues, the Education Committee and both the Senate and the House have been working on a number of bills. You remember the last year, the education reform bill had been debated for 2 years and did not pass. It was a large package. So this year, I think the strategy is for them to pass single subject bills, which have a high probability of getting passage this year. So those bills are certainly moving through the process, and we'll definitely keep you informed. And I do have some bills put together for your legislative ad hoc committee to consider either supporting, opposing, or just remaining neutral on those bills. Also, just to mention the pace and level of activity that's taking place now is certainly at an accelerated pace in the General Assembly. S 516 was placed on the Senate calendar for immediate consideration this week. That's to ensure that DHEC identifies teachers and support staff, your mission critical staff in your districts to get vaccinated and to move in phase 1A. And that bill was amended last week for second reading and should be considered this week in terms of getting third reading and going to the House. So they are certainly moving. There's a lot of exigent circumstances now that we're operating in, and we definitely need to keep our eyes on this legislation, so how it impacts the district as well, and not just here locally, but it's statewide. But at this point in time, there's several other pieces of legislation I can go into and talk about, but I'd like to answer any questions that you may have at this time.
Anybody have any questions? Ms. Green?
Darryl, do you have any idea, just from the general consensus of the members in the House about the vaccine of teachers? Do you get a feel?
I think the majority of the members want to see teachers vaccinated. Of course, we saw in the media this past week different discussions about moving people off the rolls have already been in either vaccinated already or they're already in the queue to be vaccinated. And I think we'll see an amendment this week that will make sure that teachers are moved in phase 1A, but those who are already on the list, seniors, will continue to hold their position to get vaccinated.
Thank you.
Dr. Frazier?
Yes. I just wonder, where is House Bill 3589 at this time?
House Bill 3589 is in the Education Committee and should be taken up this week, if I'm not mistaken. It passed the House already. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Cindy?
Yeah, probably needs to be through a board update, but there's surprisingly giving SCE&G and Santee Cooper and some other things that are really jumping up to the top of the list. There's been a few bills that have moved already across the the lobby. Could we get an update on those? I mean, she asked about S3589, but I think a couple came out of Senate last week or will come out of the Senate this week. The one with the removal of school boards.
Right. So that bill, removal of school board members is in really two bills, in the education accountability legislation is being debated on the Senate floor right now. That's Senator Henry's bill from Horry County, who's the chair of the Education Committee. Nobody has objected to that bill, but I think we have a mini filibuster going on with the questions that's taking place. So I don't know when that bill may be moving, but Senate Bill 203 that does the same things in terms of removing members of the school board for, various offenses like misconduct, malfeasance, misfeasance. That bill's in committee and will be taken up this week as well.
And those are just an example, but surprisingly, a few have moved already out of their respective chambers. Could you give us just an update on those and do that through it can be up our Friday update, but I think there's 3 or 4 that are already ready to cross the lobby, aren't there? Like 3589 is done in the House.
It's done in the House, it's in the Senate.
I think there's one done in the Senate, isn't there? Or will be done this week?
I'm trying to think which one that one may be.
Is that S516? That's the vaccine one?
The vaccine, that's the one I mentioned earlier.
It should be going across to the House.
It should be going across this week, yeah.
So just those ones that are fixing to cross over, it would be good for us to be up, because very soon those are going to be going to the governor's desk or to committee for comparison.
Correct. So S516, as I said again, there's a lot of discussion about, when teachers, if they move in phase 1A, make sure they protect the seniors who are already signed up. And 2, if they have had a first dose, they ensure they're going to get their second dose. But also, there's about 37,000 doses that were allocated to long-term care facilities or nursing homes. Those doses were not used, and those are going to be allocated to teachers for their vaccines. So that's already in the legislation and will take place.
And so, and 3609 is done in the House, right?
Correct.
Is that to instate the step they should have gotten on July 1st and retroactive?
It makes it retroactive, correct.
Okay,
And it's to be issued
not-
by June 15th.
Okay.
That's right.
Any other questions? If it doesn't pass for teachers to move into 1A, I mean, are you pretty comfortable that that's going to pass for teachers to move into 1A?
It's gonna be a governor battle, not a.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
He'll veto it.
I was gonna say, the real question on the table is, do we got the 2/3?
Well, I'll say this. I think based on the conversation I saw in the media this past weekend, I think there's going to be an amendment to make sure that that bill potentially will pass.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. What other questions? And y'all, we all have this at our place with way more detailed information and we will all read this tonight. Just kidding. Any other questions, Mr. Campbell? Thank you for
Thank you very much.
being here in
Appreciate
the
it.
evening. We
Certainly.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, item 6B is the ad hoc committee to review the legislative advocacy update. Reverend Mack, is that you?
Yes, I believe it was stated that I'd asked that the ad hoc committee report back in February, but that extension has been moved to March for report. So we should see a report from the ad hoc committee at the CAL meeting in March. Okay, thank you. I just want to
Okay.
give that update.
Okay, and then item 6C, determine the agenda items moving to potential consent. My notes show it's items 4A, 5B, C, and D would go to the potential consent. Is that correct? Anybody? All right, so I make a motion to move items 4A, 5B, C, and D to the consent agenda on February 22nd, 2021.
I second.
Okay, any questions about that? All right, let's vote on that. Dr. Frazier, we're just voting on what's going to the consent agenda. So that's what's up there. You want to do that? Okay, so that motion passes. The next item is just upcoming meetings. We've got school visits on the 10th, the board meeting on the 22nd, that March 8th is the committee of the whole for March, school visits on March 10th, and then March 22nd, the March board meeting. Any questions on that? Thanks to everybody who was here even earlier than I was here, because y'all did training. Y'all are awesome. And do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.